Hi, everybody. Hope you're having a good day. So I have a special guest here that I'm really excited to speak with. And those of you who follow me on Twitter, you've probably seen her commenting at times about the Johnny Depp case, in particular about other stuff too, like the Britney Spears controversy. So anyway, without further ado, I want to introduce, this is Andrea Burkhart, and she is an attorney. And I kind of just wanted to, instead of giving you a long intro, I kind of just want to ask you some questions. So is there anything that you want to tell us about yourself or discuss your intellectual evolution?
Sure. So I'm a trench warrior lawyer in a small town in the US. I'm a small town person for the most part, born and raised. I live in the same place I was born, but I have traveled a lot and been around. I spent about 3 years that I lived in Europe when I was a teenager, and did my law school down in Southern California. So I'm a lawyer. I'm a criminal defense lawyer.
I was going to ask, did you start in criminal law, or what was your job initially?
Sure. So my career trajectory was, I started as an appellate clerk in the Court of Appeals in Division II in Tacoma. So it's a fairly law review-ish, type of job. It's academia. It's right. Ivory tower. Appellate work is ivory tower law.
Okay.
So I spent a year in the ivory tower in the legal world. Gotcha. And it's great. But it's not forever. So my step after that was into public defense. So I became a public defense lawyer in a town called Yakima, Washington. And Yakima is it's a agricultural community. It's rural. It's on the east side of the Cascades in Washington. And so it's pretty well known in our state as far as having a lot of gang problems, a lot of just issues because of socioeconomic things. And it's rather militarized from my standpoint, as far as the police go. So there's very much a divide in the community between the cops and who the cops are policing. So that was kind of my introduction to public defense work. I just did like low-level misdemeanor things, DUIs, non-injury types of like DVs and assaults and drugs and all that kind of stuff.
And I'm curious, was being a public defender, was that life demoralizing in the sense that sort of the cliche that you see in the movies when people are public defense attorneys, mm-hmm. is that they're kind of like beaten down, by the job, and they see so many, terrible things, whether it's the crimes that their clients have committed or things that the police have done. All of this stuff. Did you feel like it was a very cynicism inducing experience?
Yes. Absolutely. There's no way around that. There is so much ugliness in criminal work. And so you definitely have to have a thick skin for that. The thing with the criminal defense side that I think people have to adjust to is you're going to lose. You're not doing it to win. In the ideal system, you shouldn't win. I should right. lose every time if the system is working correctly. So it's not an egotistical job.
Right.
It's not particularly glamorous. There's a lot of demands as far as the people, that you're dealing with. Your clientele is sort of by definition challenging people.
Right.
And just structurally, yeah, you're the underdog. You're the one that's getting challenged. So you have to kind of like a fight, and but at the same time, you're going to lose. You're going to get humbled. So that definitely plays into your perspective.
So you got out of, or you left the public defender's office and you moved.
So my practice at this point is all appellate work. I still do criminal defense, but it's all at the Court of Appeals level. So I've returned to the ivory tower. But, you know, I spent 10 years basically slogging through the trial trenches, and now that's part of my perspective.
Well, I think that makes you, I think that gives you such interesting perspectives, because it sounds like you just had such a range in terms of the work that you've done, more so than I think I know some attorneys. And so I guess that there were a few questions I just kind of wanted to start off with. So, okay, well, I feel like for our Johnny Depp viewers, I guess one question is, you know, were you shocked by the UK verdict, or was that less surprising to you?
Stunned. I was blown out of the water.
Really?
I could not believe.
Was it that crazy of a verdict then? Because I mean, I know some of us thought it was.
It was that crazy of a verdict. It was absolutely stunning. And part of what was stunning from my standpoint was just the audacity of it. Every lawyer knows that whoever is deciding what the facts are has an enormous amount of deference given to them in deciding who are we going to believe, who's credible, who's not credible. That's why you hear a lot in the commentary that, you know, the appeal is difficult because factual issues are not really challengeable. So having said that, I, of course, followed the entire trial, you know, as it was happening. I was not alone. I was absolutely fascinated.
Well, let me ask you, sorry, for a second. So I'm curious, just briefly, what your evolution was on the whole Johnny Depp Amber Heard case. Like, when did you get interested, and when did you start to believe that that he was not guilty, or that she was guilty?
Sure. So I had been aware, I mean, I've been aware of it for a long time. You know, it's like my guilty pleasure is the trash tabloids, you know.
Me too, yes.
Yes. So you know,
that's
so
what brought us here.
And the Daily Fail and all that, you know, I've been reading that for years. So you know, I'm not a particular Johnny Depp fan. I'm obviously aware of Johnny Depp from when I was growing up, but I think you know, last Johnny Depp movie I saw was Donnie Brasco in like 1990 something, you know, and I've never even seen the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. So I'm not like a Johnny Depp super fan, but I've been aware of who he is. And so when he's in this high profile marriage, you know, relationship and then marriage, I'm like, oh, you know, how interesting. I took note of that, and I took note of her, and like, my God, she's stunning. Like, look at her. She is absolutely spectacular. Good for him, you know, like, wow, good job, old man.
That's what she was thinking too, as it turned out, right?
As it turned out. So, you know, I'm a fairly non-judgmental person. I'm like, whatever, you know, if that's their thing, that's their thing. We'll see. Well, you know, as it turns out, it was not such a good thing. And so we all sort of saw how that unfolded. Well, I watched it, you know, fall apart in real time. And I remember just there being a lot of questions, like when she first shows up to court with her bruise, you know, like, wow, I mean, like everybody, I'm like, my goodness, that's shocking, you know, poor thing. And then, you know, even just within 24, 48, 72 hours, things are starting to come out about how, you know, the police had been called, but they didn't see anything. I'm like, well, you know, it's not necessarily everything for me. But then that photograph came out of her with Raquel walking out of the lawyer's office with her laptop, arm around Raquel, just beaming with joy, no bruise. And that's the moment where I you know, developed my preliminary judgment that probably she was not, you know, all on the up and up. But, you know, I didn't really pay that much attention to it. And of course they divorced, and it was fine, and things moved on. And poor Johnny Depp seemed like he was, you know, really in a spiral, or like some terrible pictures being, you know, taken of him for a while. And you just wonder, like, God, is he going, you know, hope everything works out for him. And so I just kind of, you know, put it in the rear view and didn't really pay any attention to it until, you know, I was aware that she's doing this stuff for the ACLU, and she's, you know, going on sort of the speaker's circuit, so to speak. And I became aware of the lawsuit being filed. Oh, that's interesting. And so then the next thing that really hit my radar was the Kate James declaration. And I remember the
Amber Heard's
personal assistant. And so that really hooked me into the court case, and like, wow, there's a lot going on here that isn't necessarily getting, you know, the front page treatment. It's not getting widely disseminated, but that's fascinating, you know, stuff. This is nitty gritty court case stuff, you know,
right. Yeah, it's like I tell my audience sometimes, and even my husband, like, I love whenever there's some high profile thing, even if it's just a divorce case, I'll go, like when the Shia LaBeouf lawsuit was filed, I went straight to the court documents, and not that people don't lie in court, as we know, but at least you're getting rid of the media obfuscation. You're taking away one layer of it, one big layer.
Exactly. And you know, legal media, like probably many types of media, is just, it's atrocious, you know, from a lawyer's standpoint. There's not even really any point in reading media commentary about legal stuff, because there's just so much that's wrong. Or they don't have good judgment because they haven't been doing it, you know, they don't have the experience to draw from. So the Kate James witness statement was what clued me in that you should pay closer attention to this case and start looking at some of these things. And so I did. And so then the absolute hammer dropped for me that, like, oh my God, this woman is a nightmare, was the video, you know, the recordings, the audio recordings that came out. And it's just so obviously crystal clear, you know, who is the problem in the relationship.
Some people are still holding on.
Well, and you know, again, humility. I try not to universalize my own experience and judgments too much, but I've talked to a lot of juries. And so I think I have, you know, a pretty good feel on being able to at least predict how other people are going to broadly look at something like that. And it's devastating for her. And the deposition, oh my God, the deposition, like that, for me as a lawyer, that is, that it's like candy. Like, I just imagine being at that deposition and, you know, what do you do with this awful person, this terrible witness? Like, oh, it's just, it was a very high drama day for those guys at work.
Seriously. Oh gosh.
So that really at that point captured me. And so I knew I was going to need to follow the trial. I followed the trial. I haven't been publicly commenting about any of this until it got into the UK trial. And I cannot believe what I'm seeing. I think the first thing I ever said was during Amber Heard's testimony. And, you know, anybody who's has read it. And I mean, I read transcripts professionally. That's what I do, you know, so I see lots of different ways that people have of explaining things and responding to questions and how questions get framed and so forth. And so I'm reading this transcript and I'm just seeing, you know, the train, like just, you know, first like this wheel is kind of, and then this end is shaking, you know, and the whole train is eventually going down the tracks.
Oh my gosh.
And it was obvious. It was very obvious. I know it was obvious to everybody in the courtroom. It was.
So your perception was that when you were watching or when you were seeing the
bombed
of the UK trial,
bombed. She bombed. I don't have a strong feelings about how Johnny Depp did. You know, there was a lot of things that he did that I thought, you know, that like they should have worked through that a little bit better. I don't think he had been very well prepped to deal with all of the hammering on the drugs and the drugs and the drugs.
So, well, I was just about to say, I'm glad you brought that. That's interesting you brought that up, because I felt like, to me, as I was reading the testimony, to me, the thing that I kept being like about just for him, you know, it didn't make him look good. I felt like too, there was some ways that the drug thing was, well, first of all, there were times when he said things regarding the drugs that I felt like were maybe stretching the truth a bit, or maybe he was trying to make himself or come off maybe a little bit better than I think was reasonable with the drug stuff. And again, for our Depp viewers, we're not saying that he was guilty or anything like that. We're just talking about weaknesses and maybe how he was prepped for it. But there was something about the drug testimony that bothered me a little too.
Yeah, and some of that is stylistic. You know, it's hard. with a jury, because it is kind of a popularity contest, and it is kind of a production. You know, there is sort of a theater to it, and it's hard because you want it to be as authentic as possible. That's what jurors will connect with. But at the same time, you know, it is, you don't know what's coming. It is unpredictable. You know, and your own instincts might not necessarily be the best way to present it. So that's just part of what goes into the preparation of a witness for a trial.
I'm curious if you were surprised, as I was, that Johnny's attorneys did not fight Amber's contention that she had donated the money. Like, were they just not able to get the subpoenas out in time, or I guess what I'm saying is the information that came out recently that shows that she did lie about at least some of that, was that they couldn't have gotten that by the UK trial? Because it seemed like it was such a big deal to the judge, or at least he said that in his ruling, that she had supposedly donated this money that she hadn't.
Yeah, I don't obviously know what their litigation strategy was. It definitely did seem to me like they had not done that. They possibly could have done that before. For whatever reason, they decided not to. I think they may have, probably understandably, looked at their case and thought it was strong. This is pretty good. You know, yeah. How much more do we really need to put up there? Do you think that, and I know you don't have any inside information or anything, but knowing what you know about how strong you think their case was and how weak Amber's case was and how much she bombed and all of that, is it conceivable that an honest, intelligent, well-meaning judge could come up with the ruling that he came up with, or does there have to be something shady about it? Well, I did characterize it as the audacity. And so I don't know what his motivation was, of course. But when I read the opinion, what I read as the lawyer looking at it is somebody who knows that his decision on the facts is untouchable, and he doesn't even care. He's going to just go ahead and flaunt that, because what are you going to do? What are you going to do about it?
Oh, so you think that the judge probably realized that the case the
judge knew the case was crap. The judge knew her case was crap. How could he not? He's a human being in the courtroom. But I believe judges.
He's trying to make a feminist statement. I know his wife is a big feminist.
It was an outcome determinant opinion, and that happens sometimes. You know, judges are human. We like to think that the process of adjudication is I impartially listen to the facts and apply the law and reach the correct decision. But humans, of course, have their own biases and filters, and judges are just the same. And some of them are, frankly, you know, better and worse at the whole impartiality bit. Mm. So I see the opinion as being outcome determinate. He knew what decision he wanted to make, and he didn't even really bother to justify it on the facts.
I love how he just dismissed, and you know, maybe this makes more sense from a strictly legal perspective, but I love how he just dismisses the audio where she's confessing her guilt and saying all these horrible things and basically admitting that Johnny Depp never fights back. And the judge dismisses it and says, it's not as good. It's not as good as legal testimony.
Wouldn't be fair to hold that against her. Wouldn't be fair to hold that against her. I mean, it is. I mean, that audacity, the audacity. How could you not hold that against her? So in that sense, I don't think it would have mattered had they gone after the donations, because he just would have written his way around it. He would have found some other reason to hang his hat on her credibility.
Right. That's a good point. So are you optimistic about the defamation trial in a year? Are you more hopeful with a jury? Is that a better sign than having a judge, or you don't know?
It's hard to say. I mean, my immediate gut instinct is yes, it's always better to have a jury. I'm a criminal. That said, I have to put myself in Johnny Depp's shoes. Johnny Depp is the prosecutor in this case.
Oh yeah.
There's mixed there's good and bad to both systems. I like the jury because the jury is a common sense process. You know, jurors are normal people. You talk to them like normal people. You tell them normal stories. You learn really fast that you can't spin some type of fabulous tale that you don't even believe and expect the jury, you know, to buy it. You've got to pitch them something that you actually believe in. And so I feel that given the strengths of Johnny Depp's case, it's going to resonate on a common sense level with most people. The risk, of course, to Johnny Depp is that he has to convince all 12. And most states for civil trials don't require a unanimous verdict, but Virginia does. And actually, now that I think about it too, it's not 12 people. I think it's 7. It's 7.
Even so, unanimous.
It has to be unanimous.
But so it takes 7 people. Okay.
Yeah, and so it's got to be unanimous, and so that means it's only going to take one person, you know, who is going to go goo eyes for Pretty Amber, you know, to I'm just not convinced. And
I hope.
And your jury is hung.
I wanted to ask you about another celebrity case and some things with the legal system, but is there anything else that you wanted to say about the Johnny Depp case? Anything that bothers you that we haven't covered about the way that it's been handled legally? Do you think he's getting good representation? Anything like that?
Yeah.
Do you like Adam Waldman? Do you think Adam Waldman's good, the way he conducts himself and everything?
Adam Waldman is a client's lawyer. Adam.
Oh, not your client. You mean he's like
he's a client's lawyer. He's not a lawyer's lawyer. He's a client's lawyer.
Gotcha.
And he does a phenomenal job for his client. He does things that might be considered unseemly, unprofessional, otherwise not the way that most lawyers don't have high profile clients and in cases and have to deal with the press and things like that. So you think even though Adam Waldman's he is very public and flamboyant and aggressive, yes, and everything, that's good. He pushes the boundaries. I mean, it's a strategic choice that they've made. It's going to make him a lot of enemies. It could potentially, you know, people are going to see him now through this lens of celebrity lawyer. A lot of people want that position, you know, for him that might be fantastic. Right. I wouldn't want that position, you know. The law is a club, you know. It's a club. You get your bar card, you're part of the club, and there is a sense that the club will look out for its own, but you have to follow the rules of the club. It's like any traditional society, you know. As long as you follow the traditions, you're good to go. And so Adam is a rule breaker. He's an iconoclast. I do think that given the realities of the case, it's been absolutely critical for Johnny to be able to defend himself, you know, publicly by presenting some of this stuff. Most lawyers would not be willing to do that. I wouldn't be doing that, but that's why I don't represent celebrities, you know.
Gotcha. So the PR thing is a really important. If you're going to be a celebrity attorney, then that is the important part of your job.
The celebrity attorney thing goes hand in hand with PR, and I mean, there is some recognition of that, like even kind of in the law and the legal rules and the professional rules and stuff, like they contemplate, yeah, there are times when, you know, your client's interests are going to require that you engage with the press and that you defend them publicly and help their reputation and stuff. And there's a whole wide variety of reasons why that is. A real basic one is that a principle in civil lawsuits is that you have, even if you're an injured person, you have a duty to mitigate your damages. You don't get to just be like, you hurt me, therefore I die, you know, and get the you know, the full benefit of all these damages. I have a duty to basically take care of myself as best as I can. And so, for example, if like a contract is breached, I don't get to just like, I find out you're not going to deliver my widgets. I don't just get to be like, well, you know, my business is bankrupt and now you're going to have to pay for it all. No, I need to go buy some widgets from somebody else. And my damages will be, you know, something to do with, you know, my having to do that and increase cost and whatever. So with somebody like Johnny Depp, who his stock in trade is his public reputation, there's a certain argument to be made that he has a duty to mitigate, the damage to his reputation that she's causing. And
That's
so Adam is absolutely playing a key role in that.
Well, that's really interesting. I'm glad you clarified that. It's not something that I've heard discussed. One thing that I wanted to ask is, and I'm sorry, this is kind of a broad question, but is there one problem that the legal system has right now, or something significant that really bugs you about the legal system, the justice system, or your profession? I'm curious, like, I want to talk about some of the good things too, but I'm curious, are there one or two things that really jump out at you?
The big thing I think in the criminal world is the access to justice. It's a little bit of a kind of a catchphrase, but it is true. There's really high volume, especially for things like family law and probates, estates, things like that. And lawyers are not cheap. It's one of those things that is really hard, I think, to get the resources together to make sure that, you can get a divorce if you need a divorce. You can get a protective order if you need a protective order.
That's not something I'd ever even thought about, is that, I obviously I know that there are lots of people who can't afford a lawyer, but I never thought about the fact that people would actually be delaying divorces and stuff like that. And it seems so obvious now that you mention it.
Yeah, well, and so I have a couple of thoughts about that. And so one is that an experience that I had in law school, that it may be common, it may not, I don't know, but it seems to me that it's common, where you just have this sudden perspective on how much law there is and how it's everywhere. It touches everything.
Like the Matrix. The Matrix.
It is. And it's for me, it happened during first year. And it's because you're sitting here during first year law school, where you're taking torts, you're taking contracts, you're taking criminal law, you're taking constitutional law, you're starting to take these, you're just starting to get exposure to business law and property law, and it's a little bit overwhelming, I think, when you sort of first grasp that, like, literally I can look at anything in my room right now. I can look at this webcam and I can see in the webcam, the IP laws for the different parts, the licensing agreements that went into it, the environmental rules concerning the manufacturing, the land use rules concerning the plants that operated under the environmental law. So you have a sense of the weight of the law and how much there is and how much it affects people in ways that they don't know, because they haven't had that experience. The other side of it, I would say, is that because lawyers are by and large for wealthy people, for the privileged people, we don't necessarily see the gap. It's almost like there's different worlds between, the world of people who use lawyers and the world of people who don't.
Right. And people who are very, and people and people that I know who are very wealthy, like really, really in the stratosphere, they not only utilize them, but it's almost like they have this army of people that can do things for them. You know what I'm saying?
Sure. And so, like, for example, the whole last couple of weeks has just been pro hac vice application after application after application for Johnny Depp.
What does that mean? Pro hac vice?
Yeah. And I think it's pro hac vice. I'm not sure totally how to pronounce it, but that's
what does it mean?
That's the lawyer who is asking to be admitted to the bar of a state that they're not fully admitted to, but for a limited purpose.
Gotcha.
And so Johnny's got his lawyers from all over, probably mostly in California, but he's obviously got international lawyers and all of these people, and they're all like, coordinating now around.
Yeah, we're talking about the Johnny Depp, just to make sure people know, the Johnny Depp lawsuit. And so you're saying he's got all of these different pro hoc
Yeah,
vistro.
and so he's got lawyers coming in, like Camila Vasquez is one of his lawyers in LA. And so she's been the one who's mainly appeared and handled a lot of the discovery disputes that have gone on in California. Those have been going on in California because all of the witnesses who are being deposed and a lot of the subpoenas to organizations and things like that are for people in places in California. So the California courts have jurisdiction over those disputes. So that's why there's this process and all these lawyers and stuff going on over there. So anyway, Camille has been like his lead lawyer dealing with the discovery disputes relating to the Amber Heard case. But then he's also brought in lawyers, like I think somebody mentioned one of the lawyers that recently appeared had been in the Rocky Brooks trial, which is a suit that's ongoing, where he's being sued for allegedly assaulting,
supposedly hitting or something,
an extra or something. I don't know, some guy who was on set. And some other people, like some of his business lawyers. He's got a massive team because he's got so many interests and so many areas where his life touches the law in big money, high profile ways, so that there are consequences, you know, if he doesn't do it exactly within the rules. With the rest of us who have, you know, much smaller lives, if we don't touch on, you know, if we don't fall squarely within the rules every single time, you know, it's probably not going to be that significant in terms of the consequences. So there's just different incentives at play, you know, when you're like, well, if I get for Johnny Depp, it's like, if I mess up this licensing agreement, that could cost me $50 million. You know, that could cost me $20 million. If I don't get my taxes, you know, exactly right, they can come after me, and, you know, we could be talking about hundreds of thousands and stuff. Right. You know, for just like some young kid at the boxing gym, he's out cutting lawns, you know, without a business license. It's going to be, who cares, you know, like maybe he'll get a $200 fine or whatever. So he doesn't have the need or the incentives or whatever to really, you know,
I see what you're saying. Yeah,
enmeshed in that legal world the way that the people with a lot at stake do.
Right. You know, I've mentioned this before on another video, but Michael Jackson's attorney famously said that people would be shocked if they knew how many times Michael Jackson had been sued for just all kinds of like either frivolous stuff or stuff that was just blatantly not true. He had a lot of paternity lawsuits against him saying he had fathered their children and things like, anyway. And I think that, so it's interesting you talk about that. And on the one hand, the wealthy make use of lawyers more and so, or have that advantage. And then also to think about how they also just have a lot more complicated, high stakes stuff and people targeting them if they're celebrities and everything. So that's interesting. It's an interesting point.
Well, I think too, a way to think about it is that, you know, the laws really are the skeleton of society. You know, everything, the whole reason that we have them is so that we can all be on the same page about what the rules are, that we can have trust in each other, that the rules are going to be followed, and that if they're not, that there's going to be, you know, order brought back to the chaos. And so, oh God, I forgot where I was going.
No, you're fine. And I'll edit that final part. No, this is going great. Well, so another question that I have, since you have done a range of legal work, I'm wondering, we've been talking on my channel a lot about MeToo and modern feminism and sort of where we're at right now with this stuff. And I was wondering, you know, without giving away any client confidentiality, but have you had any cases, or more generally, have you dealt with anything in this arena?
Sure. So I have had multiple sex cases as a criminal defense attorney. That is kind of normal. Most sex offenses are felonies. You know, there's not very many misdemeanor sex offenses. So a lot of felony cases, some, you know, violent cases. I've had a lot of that kind of stuff. Then I've also had some experience in the Title IX arena, against my old alma mater, as a matter of fact. And
just for any of our audience members who don't know, so Title IX It's a law that originally was supposed to guarantee women equal access to like facilities and like sports in high school and stuff. And you can correct me in a second if I'm wrong on this anyway, but that was the original intent. And since then, over the years, it's been expanded to basically more or less govern how things like sexual assault allegations are adjudicated at colleges and stuff. And so anyways, is that right? Kind of?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so I'm first off, I'm definitely no Title IX expert.
Right.
And there's a lot to it. But it's essentially an anti-discrimination law for education. And the idea is that, you know, in the United States, certain things are protected against discrimination. Gender-based discrimination has always gotten less protection in the courts and just historically than categories like race, religion, national origin, things along those lines. So Title IX was a statute that Congress had adopted for the specific purpose of, you know, trying to reduce discrimination in education. It's probably hard for us to think about it, you know, now today, looking back, because today women are the majority of the people in college. You know, we're probably a couple generations now from when that transition was really happening, before women, you know, were a small minority in secondary education to now where, you know, in a lot of fields, we are the majority. But so that was really the context in which it came up, and the particular type of problem that it responded to. In the US, we don't sunset our laws as a general rule. So we could talk about that, you know, if we get there and if it's interesting. But so what that ends up meaning is that we always have more laws on the books. We don't really have a practice or a way of going back and taking out things that either we don't need anymore or, you know, have served their purpose or
There's
whatever.
no spring cleaning or anything of the.
Yeah, there has not been a spring cleaning of the U.S. code
since like 1776.
Probably at least. And so Title IX is kind of one of these laws that over time circumstances have changed. And so the original need for the law is not the same as it was, but the law is still there. And so it has evolved in how it's been interpreted and what people have sort of construed it to apply to. And part of that is that the idea of what is gender discrimination and what is sex discrimination, and are those even the same thing, you know, have started to evolve as well. So Title IX currently, there's a long history with how the Department of Education had interpreted Title IX as requiring, under the Obama administration, that schools take certain steps in response to accusations of sexual assault. And so there was a famous Dear Colleagues letter that came out that essentially informed colleges and universities that if they were recipients of any type of federal funding, which includes, you know, all of your basic student loan things like your staff,
right,
your, you know, Pell Grants and all that stuff. So if you benefit from any of those federal resources, you need to follow these standards for investigating and reporting and, you know, rectifying these allegations of sexual assault on campus. And so from, you know, a criminal defendant, you know, standpoint.
Well, I'm sorry, I just wanted to say too, before it pops out of my head,
sure.
that one of the things that I don't know, maybe you could tell me, I don't know if the Department of Education specified this or if this just as a result of that letter, if this came to be the standard, but at a lot of schools, then over the past, you know, 10 years or so, you had a preponderance of evidence standard, which I've heard described as basically like 50% plus a feather, people like to say. And so one point I want to make, and you can tell me what you think about this, is that in a case of where there's alleged sexual assault, which is already often a he said, she said situation, because it is difficult to prove mostly whether sex is consensual, then, you know, that's a 50-50 there. So a 50 plus a feather is really just like almost nothing, right? I mean, isn't it almost in some cases just taking the accuser's word for it?
It's definitely just taking the accuser's word for it in some cases. And so that gets a little bit too into the nature of evidence and what evidence is, how we weigh evidence, how we, you know, compete it against other evidence and so forth. Certainly a woman's account of her experience is evidence. It would be admissible in court. It's admissible, you know, in Title IX. Yeah. It's very important. And it's an important part of the process too, because there is an extent to which adjudication is, and I think is even supposed to be, therapeutic as a process.
That's interesting.
But the women's account is obviously not the only evidence, nor is it the dispositive evidence. And so the weight that any particular piece of evidence is, you know, assigned in figuring out what happened and what do we think is justice here is always up to the fact finder. So whether the fact finder is a jury, an investigator, a judge, whoever, we understand that people's opinions can differ on that type of thing. So that's where it relates back to this burden of proof issue that came up with the Dear Colleagues letter. And so what had happened was that historically, sex assault types of claims were adjudicated under what's called a clear and convincing standard. And so clear and convincing it's kind of this middle ground standard that's used in a lot of civil cases where it's more than a preponderance, because yes, a preponderance is just, it's balance on the balance, which is probably more true or not. And so it can be the difference of a feather. Clear and convincing is not as much as a criminal case. I need to be sure beyond a reasonable doubt before I put this person in a cage. But it's somewhere in that middle ground of, I need to have more than a feather. I don't have to be like rock solid convinced, you know, but I need to be pretty convinced. So that would typically, and part of the reason for that is because the consequences of that accusation are so severe.
Yes.
Normally, if you're accusing someone of a sexual assault, that's a crime. That's going to be adjudicated in a criminal court under a criminal standard where people have to be really sure that they believe that before they're going to make that finding. So clear and convincing is still a lower, you know, standard than you're going to get if you get charged with something. And so the concern was that the Dear Colleague letter had encouraged, I believe it was encouraged, but not actually required, colleges and universities to adopt a preponderance of the evidence standard. And so what that resulted in is a, you know, situation where an accusation plus a feather, you know, is enough to get some young kid labeled as a sex offender.
Right. And I've heard, you know, I've debated this with some friends of mine in academia who are in academia, and not only are they very much in favor of this shift in policy that occurred over the last 10 or how many years, but they felt like in some ways it didn't even go far enough. That, I mean, there are a lot of people who believe that sexual assault is not being punished like it should be, and that administrations are complacent or they're trying to hide or cover up for the perpetrators. That's not my opinion. It may have been that way a long time ago, but it's not my opinion now. But I guess my point is, I've had this debate with some people, and their response to me is usually, well, look, it's not like they're going to put him in jail. Okay. It's just a matter of, oh, he has to drop out of college. Oh, boo hoo. Well, you know, that can be significant for someone, and it's, you know, it's on their record, and it has ramifications, right?
It definitely has ramifications. And I think it's only from the enormously privileged perspective of someone with a college education and participating in some type of professional lifestyle that you can devalue that.
Right.
Part of my background, you know, like I said, I'm from a small town. I I try not to like get too far at my own butt and stuff. You know, I'm not trying to go there. Like, we'll edit that out.
Do whatever you want. No, it's great.
So I'm just trying to think of how to express myself, you know, in a way that conveys what I want to. So one of my hobbies is boxing. I got into boxing several years ago. So that is me on my profile picture in Twitter.
So you're a lawyer and you box.
And so it's been a while because, you know, COVID and the gym's been closed for a year. But that was something, yeah, I got into that in my 30s. I got really super into it. I started competing and did that for a couple of years and stuff. And that was a great experience for me because boxing is not a traditional, you know, professional person's sport. It is a professional blue collar sport, and it's a professional minority sport. You know, it's Black guys, it's Hispanic guys, you know, overwhelmingly. And so it was a great environment, you know, to just meet and hang out with on the same kind of level, people who come from such a fundamentally different background and different culture than you do. We're very isolated now in our bubbles. And I'm very much a proponent of, you know, doing what we can to actually get outside of our bubbles. So in that particular situation with the Title IX, yeah, it's easy, I think, for somebody who doesn't live in the world of some of these guys that I box with, you know, who are guys that paint cars, guys that do construction, you know, stuff like that. Yeah, it's no big deal for them to not be able to go to college because they weren't going to go to college anyway. That's not their life. That's not their culture. You know, for somebody who was not part of that world, and that isn't part of like their family or their social, you know, background growing up and stuff, it's going to be extremely isolating to take that kid out of college and to take that network and those professional opportunities, that life path away from that kid. That's huge.
Right. And not to mention, you know, it's also a hugely traumatic experience, I know, for people who are falsely accused. And I'm not saying that means we shouldn't adjudicate this stuff, but I'm saying that if someone turns out to be innocent, it is quite a thing to have put that person through. And it's, you know, I'm glad too that you mentioned the issue of race and class, because you probably know this, but there is a disproportionate amount of minorities who are accused in these college cases, right? I don't know that it's a majority or not, but I've read that in proportion to the population, it's to the college's population, it's very, very high, and that you often have cases where it is a white woman accusing a Black man. Is there truth to that?
You know, I don't know if I've seen anything like statistical on it. I've certainly heard that anecdotally. It is certainly broadly true for the criminal justice system. That's one of the things that it's funny to me from my perspective is where I sit, because everything is so politicized now, right? And everything is one side or the other side. And there's no nuance, there's no middle ground. And criminal justice is one of these areas that does not fit into your political categories. It is unquestionably documented, true, established over and over and over again, that there are massive racial disproportionalities in the criminal justice system that cannot be completely accounted for by perpetration. There is a small amount that can be accounted for by perpetration rates. That's documented. That's a whole loaded, you know, subject.
I know that's a whole other question. Maybe we'll get into that future video.
we might go further into that later. But so we know that this is a problem, and we don't have a good explanation for why it is at this point. We just see it, and so it doesn't really surprise me that this is, you know, that would also be the case in the case of the college tribunal.
So you said that you have had a number of sex assault cases. Yes. And I'm curious, just broadly speaking, because this is a big subject of debate, obviously, did you ever kind of get a sense of how, like, a general percentage of false accusations that did you ever get the sense that this person, I mean, I think occasionally you did get the sense that the person you were working for was innocent and was falsely accused. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it happens. And I would say that just from my experience anecdotally, being falsely accused probably happens more often in the context of a sex crime than it does in any other type of crime. Most of my clients are guilty. And most of them also admit that they're guilty. You know, this is kind of one of the questions people always have, you know, about the criminal defense. How do you defend those guilty people? Well, if I didn't defend the guilty people, I wouldn't have anybody to defend. Like they're all guilty. So of course, you know, then to backpedal on that, no, they're not all guilty. And so, yeah, I have had that experience of people that I, you know, firmly believe were wrongly accused.
And in those cases, not specifically, of course, but generally, were those cases like cases where the accuser had innocently just mistaken them for someone else or been confused, or was it something malicious where the accuser was trying to hurt the accused?
I'll give you two examples because I think they were sort of broad swath classes of the types of things that I would see. So the first one that I remember was an extremely heartbreaking case. It was a CPS case, a child safety complaint, basically. And a girl who was 17 years old had gone to her high school and complained that her father had sexually abused her and had, you know, been doing this for some time. And it was one of these cases. The father has no history of anything like that, no history of any kind of criminal, you know, misbehavior at all. He's been, you know, married to his wife for however many years. They're a farm family. They're a conservative, you know, Christian farm family. You know, take from that what you will. And he was devastated, absolutely devastated by this accusation. What happens when somebody makes an accusation like that and the CPS organization decides that it has some merit, is they will go in and they will remove that child from the home. And so, you know, then the child is essentially placed in care, depending on the family situation. That might be a relative, that might be, you know, that might be foster care. It just depends. But so that child is removed from the home so that, you know, the allegation can be adjudicated and all of those implications sorted out. The goal in that process is the safety of the child. So that's what they're protecting. So this child was removed from the home. And what ended up happening was she aged out of the system. She turned 18 before the case had been adjudicated. And so while there are now some processes for CPS types of proceedings to extend beyond a person's 18th birthday, at the time that really wasn't the case. And so it got dropped. And she's an adult now. She can look after her own safety. Nothing further is going to be done with it. But so what had ultimately emerged, you know, in the background was, I think, anecdotally, again, sort of typical experience where, you know, this is a young girl who's brought up in a conservative household. She's starting to have sex with her boyfriend. It's starting to become a point of conflict within the family. And this was essentially her way of dealing with it.
By you believe falsely accusing the father?
Yes.
Okay. Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. And you know, again, I've already, you know, kind of given a fair amount of detail. I'm not going to go into excruciating detail, but there were lots of reasons why ultimately everybody, you know, kind of reached that conclusion. Gotcha. So CPS didn't pursue it, police didn't pursue it, you know, prosecutor didn't pursue it, and so that was that. But of course, the relationship is destroyed, and he will probably, you know, never have a normal relationship with his daughter. It's affected, of course, his relationship with his wife's relationship with the daughter, the extended family, all of that. So it's an absolutely life-changing accusation that gets made. The second situation that's kind of the broad swath of things was that stands out in my mind was the first time I saw a child fabricate an allegation. And this was a situation where, again, it's usually in a CPS type of context. And so this was a very, you know, contested breakup divorce process. And so there had been months of investigations, you know, based on various complaints and so forth before I had ever gotten involved. The disputes had been focusing on father as using excessive discipline on the children. And so that was the big question, is like, is dad beating the kids and stuff? And so there was some evidence about he would spank his kids. And that was just part of this, you know, broader warfare that was going on with the domestic situation.
Right.
So what you could see happen as the case evolved, you know, is the accusations evolve, and there's a significant amount of, you know, pressure really that mother is putting on the children to up the ante.
I have to ask you, was your client's name Woody Allen?
Woody Allen is an archetype for that type of thing. Unfortunately,
go ahead. I couldn't.
But it's sad, but it is. It's the case that it absolutely does happen. And so this child, I feel so much sympathy for this child. She was about 10 years old. And you had just seen her over the months that this accusation had gone on, and, you know, just ratcheting up more and more outrageous types of claims. Back in the 90s, they had all of the, you know, the satanic panic and the childcare cases. There was a very large, nationally significant one of those cases in Wenatchee, Washington, which is back over in the central part of the state, that I was very familiar with. And so this began to take on that sort of color of accusations that were fabulous. Things like, you know, beaten with the belt until like the blood ran and stuff, but the child has never been scarred, you know, never been to the doctor with injuries like that, things along those lines. And so ultimately the end game, I think, as it was destined to be, was that this child would accuse the father of sexual assault. She had denied vehemently, you know, in the early days, as she's being questioned over and over and over about the relationship, that he had ever, you know, done anything along those lines. But everybody has their limit, and this child, you know, in my view, reached hers, and so accused her dad of sexually assaulting her. Mm-hmm. And it was very sad, because I remember this happened. She made this disclosure during my interview of her for purposes of the criminal case had been charged against the dad for this excessive violence. So she disclosed this during my interview, and it was really sad, because she was very angry. And it was, you could see like the anger come out of her as she kind of like spits out that, well, my dad did this. And, you know, for a 10-year-old girl to have to just go through that kind of emotional processing over a parent and her parents' relationship and stuff, it was just so unhealthy for her, and I did feel terrible. And so what ultimately happened as the result of that, again, probably fortunately for my client, is that it was clear to everybody that, you know, these are escalating fabrications now. It's like you jumped the shark.
The girl really believed it by that point?
I don't think that she did.
Okay. Well,
I don't get the impression that she did believe it.
You know, when angry at her dad.
When I say she was angry, I think she was angry at the situation. She was angry that she had to say these things. She was angry that we were going to have to, you know, I think probably she knew on some level that she wasn't going to be believed, and she was angry about that. I don't think a child who is 10 years old has the sophistication to, you know, understand the context. When we say, like, if an adult woman makes an accusation out of anger, We have more just experience and processing and stuff that goes behind our reactions than a child does. She came across as a trapped animal, and it's a desperation move, and so it was very heartbreaking. What ended up happening is, her father had been charged criminally with assault, not sex assault, but assault, because of these previous allegations of the beating the children and stuff. That all ended up being dismissed. The sex charges, were never pursued. The CPS case was closed, and that was that. And that's justice. Justice is the case is closed and your entire life has been overturned, but you get it back.
That's very well said. That's very well said. And I understand the discomfort that a lot of people feel with the notion that women can sometimes lie about rape, or can sometimes lie about assault. I understand the discomfort with that, or the fear of that, because I know that what they say is, but that's not most of the time. And also, you're not thinking about all of the many times when people are raped or assaulted and their accuser is not punished. And so I recognize that there are injustices on both sides of the coin, that there are a lot of people who get away with it, or just are never even detected. But I also do believe there's a significant number of people who are innocent or falsely accused. And to me, it just seems obvious that, given what we know about the complexity of human nature, that people do all kinds of things all the time for all kinds of reasons. To me, it just seems like a no-brainer that, yes, a certain, albeit maybe small, percentage of accusations are false. And people say, but no woman would lie about rape for attention, or would lie about assault for attention, or for revenge, or for whatever. Well, maybe based on your view that you wouldn't do that. I mean, the person that I'm talking to, but you're telling me that everything that you know about the world and all of the crazy varied behavior, that you don't think it's possible. And so then, once somebody concedes that it's possible, then we're really just talking about a matter of percentages. And I've seen everything from 2% to, even in some studies, 20%. I'm not saying I think it's that high, but determination of false accusations. And so once you open the door to something that can happen, say 10% of the time, I mean, that is a significant number of accusations, right?
It is. And I think that to say that women wouldn't lie about rape is, it's just a very artificial view of women as humans. Women are humans, and humans do human things, and humans behave strategically, for different motivations. And yes, there are, we can just take the sexual allegation out of it. Yes, we know that women lie about, other things. Women sometimes, maybe frequently, lie about small things, like, whether they like your hairstyle, or just all kinds of small things. So lying is just a strategic activity that people employ. And it's more or less, entrenched as a personality characteristic, I think. And certainly as you get older and your patterns get more developed, there's going to be more of a filtering out of people who aren't comfortable with those types of strategies, right? And there's going to be people that remain comfortable with those strategies and employ them throughout their lives. And so that's one reason why I think with sexual assault allegations in particular, it's really a disservice to women to suggest that never happens. A lot of sexual assault types of accusations, they come about, they're often complicated, he said, she said types of scenarios. But, developing your sexuality as a human can be a pretty complicated, nuanced type of area. There's so much gray. Everybody's had bad sex. What does that mean? And what do you do with it? And so there's an enormous amount of growth that humans go through in becoming and maturing as sexual people. And so it's perfectly normal and understandable that young people are exploring different strategies when it comes to sexuality. And dishonesty is a strategy. I agree that most of us, as we mature as people, we might test that out to greater or lesser degrees as children and young adults and so forth. And we, develop ourselves and our personalities and our characters as, in relation to how are we going to employ this strategy. So I think, yes, as we mature, healthy, well-adjusted people are much less likely to make, false types of sexual assault allegations. But there are youthful people who are good people who will test it as a strategy because that's part of how they are coming to terms with their own development and evolution. Then there are adult people who have entrenched patterns of manipulation and dishonesty and those similar types of strategies. There's a universe of difference between those people. And it's so critical to distinguish between the people who are predators and really do need to be, dealt with for safety purposes.
Right.
And the people who are normal developing people making normal developing people mistakes.
Right. I think those are all such great points. One of the things that, as I've been reading about over the years about what's going on with these college sexual assault policies and college rape tribunals and investigations, and one of the things that comes up in a lot of these cases is where it does kind of boil down to he said, she said thing, and there's a lot of alcohol involved and so forth, is that it almost seems like in a number of these cases, what's really being adjudicated is ungentlemanly behavior, what would have in the past been referred to ungentlemanly behavior. And I'm not talking about rape, I'm not talking about actual assault or having sex with someone while they're like totally unconscious or whatever, right? But a lot of these murky situations that if you look into it, you do find a lot of this in these college sex assault accusation cases. And it used to be, in a more traditional society, that there were clear rules about women's behavior and men's behavior, and women needed to at least appear to be or try to be more virginal, and men were expected to have a sort of a gentlemanly code of conduct. Now, I'm not saying we need to go back to archaic structures, but I am saying that I do think that, as you said, people need to understand that there's a spectrum of sexual behavior, even sexual behavior that we don't like, and that yes, there is rape and sexual assaults on the end of it, but then also there's this murkier stuff that we cannot lump in with these. And it's also interesting that you talked about dishonesty as being a kind of a strategy that people try out as they're developing sexually and as they're evolving. And, I really like psychoanalysis, and I really like Freud a lot, even though, a lot of people dismiss him today, but he had a lot of good ideas. And, he understood the importance of denial, that denial and self-delusion is a really profound human cognitive mechanism. And
Absolutely.
so, it's not, I want people to understand that in cases of possible false accusation, like we're talking about, or like the videos that I make about Marilyn Manson and his accusers, that it isn't always as simple as someone who's like a stone cold, Amber Heard deceiver, right? And then it can be something more complicated. And, Amber Heard, I really do think that she has a personality disorder. She might really believe what she's saying. I kind of get that idea in a weird way. So my point, I don't know where I was going with all that, but I like the things that you said about how human nature is much more complex than the sort of MeToo narrative or slogans today give it credit for.
Well, like I mentioned, my intellectual background is ancient Greek. And so Socrates is my boy, is my man. And Socrates, of course, his famous story was about visiting the oracle at Delphi and, being told essentially that he's, the wisest person on the planet.
Tell us the story quickly.
So, oh God, now I'm gonna mess it up because I don't remember the specific details.
But I do that all the time. Tell us generally the gist.
Like, let me open this door and then slowly back away.
That's funny.
Well, the reason why I brought up Socrates and the Oracle of Delphi in the first place is because the Oracle at Delphi was, you know, the great prophet, the great oracle, and so historically it was a woman, which was very unusual in ancient Greece. Ancient Greece is one of the more patriarchal of the ancient societies. Women were, you know, more housebound. But so the Oracle of Delphi was an exception. She was a woman who essentially sat inside a volcanic vent in a cave that had a volcanic vent and would release all of these, you know, noxious gases and stuff. And so she would sit in the cave and breathe in the gases and have, you know, these crazy hallucinogenic visions and things like that. And the Greeks regarded the things that she would say in that state as, you know, the source of great wisdom and insight. Prophetic. So Socrates famously visited the Oracle at Delphi because of a question about who was he wanted to know who was the wisest man in all of Athens. Socrates would hang out in the in the town square, and he would sort of like grab the arm of the important people, you know, walking by to talk to them about, you know, what are you doing and why are you doing it that way, and how are you? He would question people about how they were living their lives. And
I can see why he was forced to commit suicide now.
Right? He was annoying. Socrates was the gadfly. He was annoying as fuck. And everybody hated him because, you know, he's calling them out on their bullshit. But anyway, so Socrates was generally regarded as a great fool, and he just wanted to know, well, great, then who's the wisest man in Athens? And I'll go talk to that guy, and maybe he can answer my questions and we can learn from him. And so the answer from the Oracle at Delphi was that, you know, Socrates is the wisest man in Athens. And his reaction is like, well, what gives? I don't know shit. You know, that's like my whole thing. I don't know anything. That's why I got to ask all these people. And, you know, that's of course, like the hidden message of Socrates and his trip is that it's by not pretending to knowledge that he doesn't have. He's far wiser than all these, you know, big important people walking around with their big important ideas.
That's great.
The Oracle at Delphi had an inscription outside of the cave, and that inscription, you know, as the introduction to all who would come and seek the guidance of the Oracle, was Neotis auton, know thyself. And just to hit back to that point that you made about Freud and the self-delusion, if that were such an obvious thing, you know, for people to say and for people to do and for people to practice, it's just odd that they would need that reminder outside of like their holiest site of wisdom. You know, people do need that reminder. We're enormously self-deluded. We did not evolve to have a clear sense of reality. You know, our evolution is based on social interactions. It's based on
subjectivity. Yes.
Subjectivity, you know, existential fears. I mean, all kinds of things color our perceptions and our experiences all the time. And so the Neotis auton is just the reminder of that, you know, make sure that you know what it is that's driving you, you know, before you lock in the wheel and step on the pedal.
That's so true.
You might find a wall in front of you.
Right. And you know, I think about, you brought up the classical Greek stuff, and I was thinking about, you know, the play Oedipus the King, Oedipus Rex, and I don't know a lot about classical Greek tragedy as much as I'd like, but what I always have loved about that story, and what Freud loved about it, is that, and I'm not going to tell the whole story, but basically look it up, somebody, but it's all about this guy who is running away from his fate. He's been told what his fate is, that he's going to marry his mother and kill his father. And he's like, I don't want any part of that. And so because of this, he runs away from his home. Well, he doesn't realize that he was adopted, and that in fact, when he's running away from his home, he's actually running toward his real mother and father. And of course, he's going to end up enacting this prophecy. And so it's all about this idea of, like you said, of the human capacity for self-delusion or just for blindness. We don't have the whole story. We don't know the whole thing. And I would imagine in the legal professions, to bring this back, but I would imagine the legal profession that there are many instances where you think that you know something, or you're kind of convinced about a case, or maybe you took someone for being guilty, you could just tell, right? And then you find out more and you're like, whoa, this isn't what I thought, right?
So I feel like I learned really early on as a lawyer to be what I would call epistemically humble. I don't know. I wasn't there. And so I'm in the same position as any fact finder is going to be. I'm going to be looking at the evidence, trying to make sense out of it, trying to reconcile it with what I know about how the world works. And that's how I form my opinion. But I learned really early on that you just can't put too much weight in your own judgments, in your own perspective. You have to try really hard to strip out your own perspective on things in order to see the things clearly.
Especially, I would think, our immediate or knee-jerk perspectives. I mean, I know that there is such a thing as gut feeling, and that gut feeling, can be very, very helpful, but sometimes it's your initial gut feeling could be misleading, right?
It can. I mean, I tend to be of the school of trust your instinct. I do tend to think that your gut, is usually right. And even if your gut isn't right, I feel like your gut is more honest. We're.
That's a good point.
I mean, I've read a lot of stuff about like Malcolm Gladwell. Blink was a really good discussion of kind of the filters and the layers, that people have. But that ultimately our motivations are emotional. We just then use our big rational brain to tell ourselves stories about why we have these emotional reactions. So the brain, you can't really trust. You can't really trust explanations. Anybody can come up with an explanation. Amber Heard's got 500 million of them, but your gut still tells you what your gut tells you, and it may not be right, but it's honest.
I like that. I like that. That's a good point.
So it's always important to listen to it. And yes, again, epistemically humble, question it, question your gut. Your gut, doesn't have any more omniscient perspective than you do. But at least it's not literally designed to be telling you, things that make you feel good about yourself and about the world, in order to process this input.
Well, and the thing about too, we started talking about this originally with sexuality, and you were pointing out about people using dishonest strategies with sexuality, and I was saying even being self-deluded. And as I've said before on a different show, that sexuality is one of our more base, animalistic, uncivilized activities or functions, whatever you want to call it. And so we already, even if everything goes according to plan, we already have this sort of built-in instability in this, because it's primarily not a verbal act, not in the way that we typically, communicate. It's not about clarity. It's often about ambivalence. And anybody who's had the experience of, hooking up with somebody that you kind of hate too. Not talking about myself, certainly. My husband will be watching this. No. But there's a lot of, and what you find, and you've read a lot, you've probably seen this too, but what you find in a lot of philosophy and literature about sexuality, Freud and others, is that eroticism and disgust are often not as far apart as we would think. And especially, if you see any of the smutty stuff that's in internet porn now, so a lot to be disgusted about. But anyway, so my point is, I think that it's inherently more problematic because sexuality lends itself to, at times, to regret and to confusion and ambivalence. And then you throw alcohol in that, which, let's not forget that alcohol accounts for the vast majority of these sexual assault allegations at colleges. It just does. And it's a volatile mix.
And alcohol, by the way, is associated with certainly sexual assault, but really crime in general outside of the academy as well. It's like one of your, biggest confounders. If you're trying to figure out why people are doing things, well, alcohol is almost always there. To your point, there's a wonderful book that I read called The Worm at the Core. And I can't remember the author off the top of my head.
Thank you.
But so the worm at the core is essentially an argument that much of human behavior can be analyzed and understood as a reaction to existential dread. The basic idea is that humans evolved down this unique path of cognitive development. And so that brought with it, increasingly sophisticated self-awareness and, the ability to project and predict and plan and all these types of things. And so inherent in that was the recognition that we are going to die. My dog sitting right here, is sentient and sweet and wonderful. And I don't actually know what's going on in his mind, but I'm pretty sure he doesn't really spend much time worrying about whether he's going to die. But for people, we're aware of that. And so much of what we do, and that's a very troubling and disturbing thought. We are biologically programmed, fight or flight, to see death coming and have, a massive chemical reaction to drive a self-preservation instinct where we will try so hard to stay alive and preserve our biological integrity.
Basically what you're saying is that our primary, most basic instinct, which is our survival instinct, also we're aware that it's completely doomed to failure.
Absolutely. Exactly. We know we're going to lose. We know we're going to lose. And so there's all kinds of cultural practices and just normal behaviors and things like that this particular author went and looked at and did some, empirical type of testing on to evaluate, how does that relate to the drive to kind of suppress that fear that is always, potentially present, that you're going to die. And then what happens if we expose you to triggers that remind you that you might die? And how do all these things play together? So I bring this up because in the context of sexuality, Camille Paglia, one of my favorites, talked about, there's a link between sexuality and death. These are commonly linked cultural themes, and you
like
see
the
them.
The French, I'm sure you know this, the French word for orgasm, right? Yes. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Death. Sorry for some of our readers. Anyway.
Yes, the little death. And so but it's also, it's part of a lot of mythology and a lot of themes. We have our almost most romantic ideal is this till death do we part, and we just have this recognition of the relationship between, bonding and this life process that you go through, and maybe you birth. I didn't birth. I'll put that out there too. I don't have any kids.
No, I don't either.
But that's obviously a thing that people do. And those kids are going to die also, and so these are just things that
inherent futilities and,
inherent futilities.
Yeah.
And it's all just because, we are, the condition of our existence as humans is we are this biological creature. We might be more things than that, there's lots of room to debate about that. Sure. But at the core, we're this biological creature, and the fate of all biological creatures is to die. So it's that embodied quality of how we live that is really at its peak, in good sex, right? Good sex is like the best way to have a human body, right?
I see what you're saying. Yes.
If you could be at that end of the spectrum, all the time, there's actually probably internet stories about how that's a terrible thing. And, but So there's this very strong link between these compelling biological functions. And so a lot of sexuality and behaviors with sexuality are very closely related to this existential guilt and can trigger this type of existential guilt and these other types of reactions. So it was
especially too when you that's so true, and especially too when you layer in all kinds of other sort of Freudian stuff that's going on with like parents, you know, and past experiences and maybe even past abuse and just a soup of things.
And just other things like fear and trust and all these other things that you're learning about, you know, socially anyway, with how to, and shame and how to interact with people and what are other people going to think.
Right.
Sex is loaded. It's super loaded. And that's a big reason why, because it's very significant and it's very fraught with meaning.
Right. No, that's very true. And it's like you said too, it's, you know, everybody kind of responds to it differently. And just because you might have a certain small subset of people that choose to be dishonest sexually or to even falsely accuse someone, it's not a statement about the majority. But, you know, this was one of the arguments, and we don't need to get off on this tangent, but one of the things I've been arguing about the Marilyn Manson case is that, yes, I know there have been a number of, some of them more serious than others, but a number of accusations from different women, but also a man like him who has had so many sexual experiences, so like probably an incomprehensible number to us, but so many. And also, just to be quite honest, it would probably tend to attract, it's not a judgment about his music per se, but would tend to attract maybe more psychologically disturbed people than, like, I don't know, would be a fan of Josh Groban or something, right? Mm-hmm. And so you think about that, and I was just saying, you know, we have to understand these are really heightened, sensationalized conditions here, and we're getting the view of this tiny subset of women. And so anyway, I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but I think it's something to think about.
I think that for most people, as you grow and mature, the hard thing about maturing into something like sexuality is because it's very fraught with meaning, and so it becomes a big part of your identity. You know, your identity. I tend to have the viewpoint that you know, come talk to me about your identity when you're like 35, you know, because before then there's so much growth that's happening, and
some of it can actually be really extreme growth too. I mean, I don't know if you've had the experience. I flip-flopped, not about my sexuality, about a number of other really key things a number of times.
Sure. And I think that's just part of experiencing life and trying out your strategies and figuring out not only what works, but what makes you feel good about yourself. What is the identity and the character and so forth that you want to adopt? So it is hard with sex because, you know, there is a lot of shame, even, you know, just for people,
normal sexuality.
Normal people doing what normal people do. And that was one of the things that I would mention as kind of an interesting, I guess, aside about the Title IX type of context. The Title IX context is very different from the criminal context. You know, being accused in a college is very different from being accused by the police in jail and in court and so forth. But a big piece of that is that, like you suggested, the consequences are not quite on the same page as you could end up in a cage. You know, when you could end up in a cage, you're going to be pretty defensive about that. And that's going to really, you know, that's going to be a lot of fear driving you, and essentially how you develop your strategy to overcome that challenge. With Title IX, because it is, you know, arguably maybe just not as big of a deal, obviously still a big deal, but just relatively speaking, And also, I think because it's taking place in what is otherwise seen as a friendly environment, it's a friendly forum, you know, it's your college. You don't, I think most kids aren't really thinking about their college as an adversary. And in these types of proceedings, they really need to, which is hard.
Right.
But so because of that, I think there is maybe, I won't talk, of course, about what I talk with my criminal clients about behind the scenes, you know, but of course, part of what I do is just counsel them about, you know, what do they want to tell me? How are we going to present their version, you know, to a jury? How are we going to defend their case? Let's just back up to there. How are we going to defend their case? Not every case is a factual defense, you know. Some cases are, you know, yes, the person did it, you know, but then there are cases where there is a factual defense, and so the question becomes how are you really going to present that and develop that? And so when you have a lawyer in a criminal court, you know, I'm going to give you certain advice, you know, like we're going to practice. I'm not going to coach people. I don't tell people what to say, you know, but it would be absolutely irresponsible of me not to hear somebody's story and then say, here's my feedback about what a jury might think.
Right. I see. Yes.
So, you know, so there's a counseling process that goes on with that. A lot of kids in Title IX aren't represented by lawyers either because, you know, they can't afford it or whatever, or the school sometimes doesn't allow it.
And they're not allowed sometimes too, right?
Yeah. I think that's rare anymore. Although I did have a comment, the first Title IX suit that I did conclude successfully. We were called into the Dean of Students' office for him to read basically read and deliver us the formal ruling, throwing out this complaint. And I made a comment at the time about how, you know, just a professional nicety, you know, thank you for allowing me to participate. And the Dean of Students said, well, we didn't have any choice. And I thought that was quite interesting, you know, to suggest that they, you know, might have preferred it the otherwise.
That they almost see you as being an adversary there.
I am an adversary because nobody else will be. And the college may see itself as the student's friend, but in that context, they're not. And I might be the only person calling that out in the whole room.
Mm-hmm.
So that factors into how the kid is going to present. And so when a young man has been accused of being, as you say, ungentlemanly in a sexual type of encounter, he may very well have his own ambivalence about that encounter. And I was drunk and I don't normally, you know, want to do things like that. And we were kind of exploring. He's going to have his own feelings of guilt and insecurity and shame that he's going to be processing. And if he goes and processes that to the tribunal, they're his adversary. They're going to jump right on that and know, oh gosh, well, so you did feel guilty about how you treated her. And now we're done, you know, case closed.
We're got our feather.
Absolutely. Because the kid has admitted to being human and to having complex feelings about the situation. Let me tell you, the people that you want to be afraid of are the ones that don't have complex feelings about the situations. And, you know, I have plenty of experience with them as well.
I'm sure. Well, you know, I think those are all such good points. I was trying to look and see because the time has just been flying, but I wanted to make sure there's a few things we get to. This has been so awesome. But to go all the way back to the O.J. Simpson case, and yes, we know O.J. was guilty, but this is what I wanted to ask you finally about the criminal justice system is that I remember watching that trial and totally believing and still believe that OJ is guilty. And I think he basically came out and admitted it basically, right, in that book. But if I did it, hey, maybe Amber Heard can do that next.
Yes.
So, but you know, one of the things that I do remember, and this is one of the reasons why he was found innocent, is that, and I know it was early in the days of using DNA. It was like one of the first DNA court cases, but there were all of these mistakes and like all of this sloppiness on the part of the criminologists or the cops or whatever that came out about the way it was, the DNA was collected or the blood samples handled and this and that. And I saw a couple of years ago, I saw a PBS Frontline documentary that was talking about how a lot of criminal justice science, even something like fingerprints, that's used in the courtroom, it's really not very accurate. And that in fact, we would be alarmed if we realized how inaccurate some of this supposedly hardcore criminal science is. So could you talk about that before we go?
Oh boy, this is potentially a really big door. Because I could talk about this for hours. This is an issue I've litigated, I've researched, I'm really in on. So
right.
So first off, by way of background, it is always the lawyer's job to poke holes, of course, in the forensics and the collection. You know, every stage where doubt can be introduced, that's sort of 101 lawyering is poke your holes in it. And there's always holes. There's always, you know, something that you can identify. Whether or not they're significant enough to be like outcome determinant is really, you know, that's what really happens with a jury's deliberation is, okay, given that mistakes happened, do they undermine our confidence in the outcome? There is, I mean, a massive amount of research and scholarship and public attention that's been given in probably the last 10 to 15 years on the state of forensic science in the United States. There was a big, what you're probably referring to is there's a big report that came out. I can't remember the year now. You know, time changes as you age. Mm-hmm. I'm going to say it's like last year, and it turns out it's a decade ago. But so this report that the National Academy of the Sciences released on essentially like just. It's a national organization of scientists and policymakers and criminal justice people and so forth. And they're just looking at, well, what are some of these common scientific practices that get used in criminal cases? And are they any good? Like, what do we know about them? How validated are they? What are they validated for? Right. And so that report caused a huge splash because there are a significant, you know, number of scientific facts, you know, and methodologies and so forth that get presented that are absolute nonsense. So every once in a while, something will get a real high profile, and we've been moving away from that. In my view, we've been, you know, gradually, incrementally getting more and more scientific over time, but it's still pretty bad. But there's some great old school examples of this. One very famous case in Washington had to do with testimony from a canine officer, you know, got a trained dog, and the testimony concerned the dog's training to be able to detect the fresh guilt scent. And so upon detecting the fresh guilt scent, when you're guilty. Literally the scent of fresh guilt. This man is testifying in a court of law that his dog can sniff out and ascertain from stale guilt and fresh innocence. Wow. follow that smell to lead them to the defendant. So that's a great example of one that's just so obviously over the top that even the Supreme Court of Washington, even back in like the 70s or 80s, said, you know, this is crossing a line. Like this is obviously pseudoscientific nonsense. But the problem is that because the court is not an expert itself, most lawyers are lawyers because they were bad at math and science. And so they don't, you know, they defer to people who do have that expertise. So then when you get into the forensic system, and the forensics is the use of various sciences for use in the justice system.
Yeah, and just so we're clear on what we're talking about, it could be anything from, and fill in the gaps for me, but like fingerprint to like blood, analyzing the pattern of blood spatters, to dogs sniffing out, and probably a lot of other stuff too I'm not thinking of, right?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different forensic methodologies, and there's psychological forensics, you know, is a big one. People will do psych evaluations of people to find out, are they competent to stand trial? Are they, you know, were they insane at the time? Just those kinds of considerations. Then there's all kinds of physical evidence as well, which is kind of what we're describing: the DNA, you know, photography. Like the big thing now is, because there's cameras everywhere, you know, so if you want to you know, you have a report of like a fight happened on the street or whatever, the first thing the police are going to do is like, okay, go to every business in the perimeter, you know, find their perimeters, you know, find their cameras, get their camera systems. So anyway, all of that is forensic type of evidence. The fresh guilt scent is a high profile example of one that's really absurd. But the problem is that in the forensic system now, you have incentives for people to offer themselves as experts, and to essentially build a practice, you know, a professional practice off of being an expert for court, and analyzing and writing reports, and going in and testifying and stuff. And those, you know, incentives, in my view, have created a little bit of a distorting effect, you know, on the validity of the science that goes in. And part of that is because, you know, you have, it's a very polarized system. You have the state versus the defendant. And so, you know, the state's incentives are aligned in, let's get this guy in the box, and the defendant's, you know, incentives are aligned in, let's get him free. So you have sort of science that is by and large being driven on the state end, the investigative side of things, that is, you know, motivated by that relationship with the state for the purpose of putting the person in jail. And as a result, it doesn't get treated with the skepticism that it should. It doesn't get treated with the criticism that it should. So the National Academy of the Sciences report was like the big sort of bomb that went off in the criminal justice community about how bad the science was. And it was followed up a few years later under the Obama administration. Its shorthand is called the PCAST report, and I can't remember exactly what it stands for. The President's Council on Academic and Science Technology. I don't remember, something like that. PCAST. And so they talk about a lot of these really common forensic techniques that are used, and sort of how they came about. So I'll use fingerprinting as an example because it's a pretty well-known example of something that people take for granted, that like fingerprint evidence is good evidence, right?
Like your DNA, right?
Yes. Right. And so fingerprint evidence, if you didn't know, you would probably think, wow, if they found that guy's fingerprint, you know, on the murder weapon, then, you know, we're done. Like, stop the trial, just send him away now. So what you wouldn't know is that the basic premise of fingerprint testimony, which is the uniqueness of an individual's fingerprint, that's never been validated. It's assumed, but it's never actually been validated. Nobody has gone in and confirmed that. A second issue is that people don't.
And I just want to say, sorry, that there is a case in this documentary about a man who was arrested for a bombing in Spain. Oh, do you know? I'm sorry, I stole it. Tell us. No, tell us.
Sorry. Yeah, and so the lawyer, the American lawyer who got arrested and charged for committing this bombing, it was one of the bombing of the Spanish train within a few years of 9/11. and it was based on fingerprint. And as it turned out, the lawyer had an absolutely rock solid alibi, you know, could be placed elsewhere. It wasn't his fingerprint. And so investigation, you know, he goes through a lot of trouble, you know, but is fortunately a lawyer and can extract himself from that problem.
And they have the fingerprint that they matched with him, right? They matched it.
Yes, they matched it. Yes, they matched it.
And it wasn't his.
and it wasn't his. It ended up being this this gentleman. I think he was an Ethiopian immigrant to Spain, who had, you know, some radical contacts and, you know, otherwise a sort of predictable account of what you would expect for a train bombing.
Right.
So there was a lot that came out of that situation, because it illustrated the way that bias gets introduced into forensic analysis in a way that people don't understand, and they don't appreciate how powerful it is, because we think of science as this objective process, and it's not. And so there's been a whole lot of subsequent testing and validation that different, like mostly accrediting organizations for different types of forensic scientists and stuff have done in response to this specific incident of the lawyer in the Spanish train bombing, because they wanted to figure out, you know, okay, well, how did we get it wrong? What went wrong? And how do we prevent that in the future? And so as it turns out, a big part of the problem with the Spanish train bombing, well, let me back up and first explain just real quickly some of the technical stuff with fingerprint analysis. And so fingerprint analysis is it's a comparison for points of similarity. And so that in and of itself, if you just look at that and you're like, well, but it's similar, you know, at 7 points, I think is the minimum under the US standard. It's similar at 7 points, then, you know, then that's going to be good enough. What you're not appreciating is that 7 points can be cherry picked out of the thousands and thousands of points that are on any given fingerprint. And similar point of similarity is it can be a matter of judgment. It's not always a black and white, you know. So
you're telling me like some of this supposedly objective science, like fingerprinting, which people think is so rock solid, is potentially
it's very subjective.
Yeah. Okay.
DNA evidence has a significant subjective component to it, which people also don't know. And so the way that happens is, now I'm not a genetic scientist. Please don't jump on me if I get some detailed stuff wrong. But the general gist of it, as I understand it, is this. The process for DNA analysis is they have a sample, they isolate the DNA, they go through a process of essentially sorting out specific segments of the DNA that have been, you know, kind of standardized for purposes of being able to do identification. So there's like certain chains of the DNA that are useful for that. So they go in and they extract those pieces, they isolate them, and then
like if you're looking at a dead body to figure out who it is, you know that there's certain things like the teeth that you can look at more as identifiers. So you're saying in the DNA, there are these components that they isolate that identify. Okay.
Loci or whatever, the locus, you know, there's multiple locuses that they look at for purposes of being able to do these comparisons. So that then gets amplified, meaning they make a whole bunch of copies of it so that they can, you know, have a lot to work with and get like a strong signal from it, so to speak. And so then the amplification process results in, you know, this highly concentrated amount of, you know, genetic material that then gets basically digitally translated. It goes through like a computer, you know, analytical process where they go through and, you know, the GTAC, you know, does the breakdown and essentially maps it, and gives you a you know, spherical visual like graph type of, which is what you are normally you're used to seeing when you see the DNA, and it's like the graphs,
helix,
the different bars. So there's a few processes in there that I just described where there are subjective steps that can be taken that can affect that analysis. So first off,
when you used the word amplify earlier, yes. I was like,
yeah. Well, so the amplification might be the least troubling part of the process. So a big, actually that is one of the situation that comes up because DNA degrades over time. You know, it's a biological material, and so it decomposes. And so you may not get all of, you know, you have genetic material. It might just be like pieces from this or that. You might not have a complete strand. You might not have lots of complete strands.
Like in Jurassic Park, where they have to fill in the DNA because they don't have, it's degraded anyway.
Yeah. So that's a good example. So if the DNA is degraded, there's judgment calls made all along the way about how good is this? Can we fix it? Can we interpret it? Can we move? Is it, you know, of sufficient quality to be able to compare it to other things? And so we don't see that process, you know, that's going in. We just see at the end that somebody says, well, here's a bar of the DNA and it's a match to this person, and that matches to a probability of like 1 in 9 quadrillion. Right. You don't see the judgment steps that led up to them concluding this is an accurate representation of this, you know, DNA sample that we got, because there's so much, you know, I don't want to say there's so much manipulation to it, because it's not, you know, they're not trying to change it or anything.
It's a filtering process though, because
it's a filtering process.
It can have distortions is what I mean. As hearing you saying is that is it conceivable that there have been cases in the legal system since DNA started being used that maybe where DNA was wrongly attributed to someone? Definitely. It's almost certain that that's happened. I mean, is this common knowledge? Like, is this? I mean, it's not for me to not know.
I think it is. Yeah, I mean, I think it is in the scientific community. Maybe it's not. It may be one of these things that is like, you know, people just don't talk about it. So the last big case that I took to trial was a murder trial, and this was a few years ago now, and one of the issues was going to have to do with some forensic evidence and the strength of the inferences that could be drawn from that. In my particular case, what I was dealing with was ballistics, you know, firearms stuff.
Oh yeah.
And so there's a lot of different you know, a lot of different types of ballistics analysis, but what I was dealing with was what they call shell casing analysis. And so when you have, so a bullet is a cartridge, which is metal. The metal cartridge it's sealed, and it contains the gunpowder, and it contains the actual bullet, the lead projectile, usually lead projectile. And so then when you have it in the gun and you fire the gun has a firing pin. The pin strikes the back of the cartridge, that ignites the gunpowder, and basically the cartridge, then the end of the cartridge, like, you know, pops the projectile out, and that's what, you know, makes the gun fire. So everything that's in the gun, the mechanism that's working on the cartridge is metal, and it's harder metal than the usually brass that the cartridge is made out of. So it'll leave marks on it. It'll leave tool marks. And so there's all these different, you know, analyses that can be done to be like, well, does this, you know, do the tool marks on this cartridge look a lot like the tool marks on this other cartridge? And that's basically how you match a gun.
Wow.
So I had a forensic scientist that I worked with on this case, and it's like, I think any profession, it's a club, and so it's hard to get people to speak against their club. You know, they don't really want to. And so the gentleman I was working with,
especially when, like you said, most of the time, probably the accused are guilty. And so
absolutely. Absolutely. And the, you know, people have spent their entire professions, you know, doing this. It's important to them. They believe in it. And these are all normal, human, well-motivated things. But so it does, you know, potentially blind them to some of the flaws. What I learned, the gentleman that I worked with was wonderful. He had, you know, spent 50 years, you know, as a forensic expert at very high levels, had his own lab and everything, and was very honest about the limitations of the science. And that experience was, you know, really in contrast for me with, you know, many other circumstances where I've had to cross-examine like the state's experts, you know, so in Washington, our forensics for the state are done by the Washington State Patrol, has its own series of crime labs. And so, you know, it's the same staff, the same people, they just have different locations and whatever. So you kind of get a feel for who all the scientists are. And there is much more maybe of a team kind of approach because of that structure than if the state did what I do, which is just hire whoever is available who will take your call, you know, when you need an expert.
Right. I know you have to leave soon and everything. So we're don't worry, we'll wrap this up. It's so interesting though, but please continue. So what you're saying.
So there's just disincentives for people to be critical of their own, you know, field. And part of it is political because they don't want to be, you know, seen as criticizing their colleagues and the people that they've worked with.
And there's a real public mythology around some of it too, with, you know, I've seen so many crime shows and Law and Order episodes and all kinds of things. And so it's interesting to hear this other perspective, which we probably should have known, but that there are real questions and issues with supposedly rock solid forensic evidence, even if it's often helpful.
Absolutely. And that's oftentimes one of my, you know, biggest strategies as the defense attorney is how am I going to educate the jury on these limitations, because the state's not going to do that. And if I question them about these limitations, you know, they're going to get defensive and hostile with me. And that's, you know, never a very persuasive thing for the jury. So yeah, I'm usually in the situation of having to figure out, you know, is there an expert I need to hire? You know, can I interview this scientist ahead of time and like get them to acknowledge some of these things? But that's a huge part of it, because if the jury doesn't have that information, yeah, they're going to get that DNA evidence. They're going to get that alcohol breath test, that DUI breath test. They're going to think that's rock solid. Breath test is junk. Breath test, junk.
Oh, wow. Well, listen, we've talked for a while and it's been so awesome, but I would definitely like to make use of you in the future, because we just really barely here at the end scratch the surface, I know, with a lot of this stuff. And there's other cases too that, you know, one thing I was thinking could be interesting would even be that we just look at a particular, you know, case. I know we did with Johnny Depp today, but I was thinking about all these other cases that we've heard about in the past and stuff. So I don't know, but I'm going to give it some thought, but I definitely want to have you back. And I thought this was great. I thought it was wonderful. So
thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. So I'm going to say goodbye to our audience now. Thank you everybody for joining us. And we're going to have Andrea back again for sure. So thank you so much, Andrea.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.